Like, there's a lone wolf part of me that maybe you can relate to, but I like being by myself.
There are stories in rock and roll that never really end. They just go quiet for a while, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. The story of James Hetfield and Dave Mustaine is exactly that kind of story. It is not simply a tale of two musicians who fell out. It is a decades-long reckoning with loyalty, identity, creative ownership, and the price of ambition. And now, at 61 years old, James Hetfield, the man who built one of the most powerful bands in the history of heavy metal, is finally speaking with a depth and honesty that fans have been waiting years to hear. What he is saying about Dave Mustaine and Megadeth is not what anyone expected. And that is precisely what makes it so important. To understand what Hetfield is opening up about today, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not the famous beginning, not the one where Metallica is already conquering arenas and magazine covers, but the raw, unpolished, barely organized beginning. The year is 1981. Lars Ulrich has placed an advertisement in a Los Angeles newspaper looking for musicians who share his passion for the new wave of British heavy metal. James Hetfield answers that ad. The two begin building something fragile, something that could have collapsed under the weight of its own ambition at any moment. But they need more. They need electricity. They need someone who can match their hunger with actual technical firepower. That person turns out to be Dave Mustaine. Mustaine walks into Metallica like a force of weather. He is technically gifted in a way that both Hetfield and Ulrich recognize immediately. His guitar playing is jagged and aggressive, full of speed and attitude, and his presence pushes the whole band to a higher level. He co-writes riffs and song ideas that become foundational to Metallica's early sound. Tracks that would later appear on their debut album carry unmistakable traces of Mustaine's energy and musical thinking. In those early rehearsal spaces, something extraordinary is being built. And Mustaine is very much part of the blueprint. But brilliance and volatility are not always easy to separate, and with Mustaine, they were almost impossible to distinguish. His behavior became a persistent problem. The drinking was severe. The outbursts were unpredictable. There were confrontations with bandmates, with crew, with anyone who crossed into the path of his frustration. Hetfield, who even then had a deep sense of what the band required to survive, watched the situation deteriorate with growing unease. The breaking point came not with a dramatic scene or a public confrontation, but with something almost mundane. An incident involving Mustaine's dog and a damaged car belonging to bassist Ron McGovney led to a physical altercation. Mustaine struck Hetfield. Whatever had been holding the arrangement together snapped completely. The decision to remove Mustaine was not made lightly, but it was made decisively. Just days before Metallica was scheduled to record their debut album, they put Mustaine on a Greyhound bus bound for Los Angeles. No drawn-out conversation. No careful goodbye. Just a hard, final exit from the band he had helped shape. Hetfield has since described that moment as one of the most difficult of his early life, not because he doubted the decision, but because he understood the weight of it. You do not kick someone out of a band they helped build without carrying some part of that with you. And Hetfield carried it. For a very long time. What Mustaine did next is one of the great comeback stories in rock history. He did not disappear. He did not retreat. He formed Megadeth with a fury and intention that transformed his personal pain into professional purpose. Every record Megadeth made in those early years was charged with the energy of someone who had been discarded and was determined to make the people who discarded him regret it. He was technically relentless, pushing the complexity and speed of his music far beyond what most bands were willing to attempt. He gave interviews where he called out Metallica with a directness that was sometimes brutal. He was not subtle about his feelings, and his fans loved him for it. Mustaine became the voice of the scorned, the anti-establishment figure in a scene that was already anti-establishment by definition. Metallica, meanwhile, was doing something different. They were evolving. Ride the Lightning arrived in 1984 and announced a band that was maturing rapidly, exploring darker emotional terrain and more complex compositions. Master of Puppets in 1986 elevated them into a category almost entirely their own. These were albums of staggering ambition, and they arrived without Mustaine's name in the credits. Yet anyone who listened carefully, anyone who knew the history, could hear the ghost of those early collaborations somewhere in the architecture of the sound. The foundation had been built by multiple hands. What stood on top of it, however, was Metallica's to claim. Hetfield has reflected on this period in recent years with a kind of careful honesty. He acknowledges that he was not fully equipped, emotionally or personally, to handle the fallout from Mustaine's departure in the way it deserved. He was young, driven, and focused almost entirely on forward momentum. Looking back at someone you have hurt requires a stillness that ambition does not naturally produce. Hetfield admits that his silence on the subject, the years of not reaching out, not acknowledging the complexity of what had happened, was its own kind of wound. He did not mean it as abandonment, but he understands how it was received. By the early 1990s, both bands had become institutions. The Black Album made Metallica a global phenomenon in 1991, selling in numbers that transcended genre and redefined what a metal band could achieve commercially. Meanwhile, Megadeth's Rust in Peace, released the year before, is now widely regarded as one of the most technically accomplished metal albums ever recorded. The two bands had grown into their rivalries, their differences, and their respective greatness. And the fans had drawn their lines accordingly. The culture around the Metallica-Megadeth divide became something almost anthropological. You pledged loyalty to one or the other, and that choice said something about who you were and what you valued in music. Metallica represented evolution, accessibility, the willingness to reach a broader audience even at the cost of some credibility among purists. Megadeth represented purity, technical ferocity, the refusal to compromise even when compromise might have meant greater commercial reward. Both positions had dignity. Both had truth. But the tribalism they created sometimes obscured the more honest reality, which was that both bands were extraordinary, and the rivalry between them had pushed each to heights they might not have reached independently. Hetfield, now looking back from the vantage point of 61 years, speaks about the rivalry with a maturity that was simply not available to him in his 30s or 40s. Age does something to a person, particularly a person who has walked through the fires that Hetfield has walked through. His battle with alcoholism, his time in rehabilitation, his complicated relationship with fame and identity, all of it has forced him into a kind of honest self-examination that younger men rarely manage. When he speaks about Mustaine now, it is not with the guarded deflection of someone protecting a reputation. It is with the measured weight of someone who has genuinely thought about what happened, what it meant, and what it cost. The documentary Some Kind of Monster, released in 2004, gave the world its first real glimpse of what a conversation between these two men might look like. The cameras captured a meeting that was raw and unscripted in a way that rock documentaries almost never are. Mustaine, stripped of his usual combative armor, sat across from Hetfield and said something that had been waiting over 20 years to be said. He felt he had been thrown away without acknowledgement. He felt that his contributions had been erased. He felt that the people he had helped build something with had simply moved on, leaving him to figure out, alone, what that abandonment meant. There were no accusations in his voice. There was something worse. There was grief. Hetfield did not try to argue or defend. He listened. And then he spoke about survival. He explained that the decisions made in those early years were not made from cruelty but from necessity. The band was barely holding together. The substances, the volatility, the pressure of trying to build something real out of very little, all of it demanded choices that no one was old enough or wise enough to make gracefully. He expressed remorse, not the performed kind, but the quiet, visible kind that lives in a person's posture and the hesitations in their speech. It was not a resolution, but it was a beginning. In the years since that documentary, Hetfield has continued to process what the Mustaine chapter means in the larger story of his life. At 61, he is a different man than the one who sat across from Mustaine in that room. He has been sober for years. He has done extensive personal work through therapy and rehabilitation programs. He has learned, in the way that only sustained effort teaches, how to look at painful history without flinching away from it. And increasingly, what he sees when he looks at the Dave Mustaine chapter is not just a casualty of a young band's self-preservation instinct. He sees a person who deserved more care than he received. This is not a small thing for Hetfield to say. He is not a man given to easy emotional disclosure. His public persona has always been defined by strength, stoicism, and a kind of iron-willed forward momentum. The idea of looking back, of acknowledging where things went wrong in deeply personal terms, runs against the grain of everything his public image has been built upon. And yet he is doing it. Because at 61, the calculus changes. The things you did not say begin to weigh more than the things you did say. The conversations you did not have begin to feel more urgent than the ones you managed to have. He speaks about Mustaine's talent with a sincerity that has deepened over time. In recent interviews, he has said that Mustaine's guitar work in those early days was something he has never encountered at quite the same pitch since. There was a combination of rawness and precision that was genuinely rare. The songs they built together in those early rehearsals had an energy that came directly from the friction between their personalities. Hetfield's controlled intensity meeting Mustaine's explosive aggression produced something that neither could have produced alone. He understands that now in a way that was simply not available to him when he was 22 years old and trying to keep a band from falling apart. The question of publishing rights and creative credit remains unresolved and remains, by all accounts, the deepest point of contention between them. Mustaine has spoken publicly and repeatedly about his belief that certain songs he helped write were claimed in ways that did not fully reflect his contribution. He brought this up again in 2023 when the two men were reportedly discussing a potential collaborative project, and by his account, the conversation ended almost immediately. Hetfield went quiet. The door closed. Not with anger, but with a silence that was, in its own way, an answer. Hetfield's perspective on this is more guarded, which is characteristic of him. He does not dismiss the subject, but he does not engage it head-on either. What he has said, in measured terms, is that creative ownership is a complicated question when music is made collectively in conditions of chaos and youth. Who owns what when a group of barely formed musicians are throwing ideas at each other in a rehearsal space at 2 a.m, fueled by adrenaline and very little else, is not a question with clean answers. He acknowledges Mustaine's contributions. He simply does not agree on where acknowledgement ends and formal credit begins. This gap, this persistent painful gap, is perhaps the most human part of the whole story. It is not a villain's refusal to give credit. It is not a martyr's cry for justice. It is the ordinary, complicated, almost universal human situation of two people who experienced the same events and came away with fundamentally different understandings of what those events meant. Both of them are right about something. Both of them are missing something. And neither of them has yet found the words, or the willingness, to fully bridge the distance between those two truths. At 61, Hetfield seems to understand that the bridge may never be fully built. But he also seems to have reached a place where that is something he can hold without being destroyed by it. He expresses respect for what Mustaine built with Megadeth. He says it with specificity, not as a diplomatic gesture but as a genuine acknowledgement of a body of work that stands on its own terms regardless of what came before it. Mustaine took his exile and made it into something formidable.